Hello, girls. This is respiratory system for those who cannot be in class in person. Okay, we're just going to start with the terminology. The first term is the pharynx, which really you can just substitute it with the throat, more or less. The pharynx is behind the nose, behind the mouth, and extends a little bit lower. It's got all these fancy names, which you don't need to learn because I'm not into detailed terminology. So the pharynx is the throat. So it's all this bright blue-green part. Then notice that it divides into two. In the front, the anterior part, in the front, it's the windpipe, called the trachea. In the back, it's the esophagus. So the pharynx divides into two. The air and food are common to the pharynx. Then air goes in this pipe and food goes into that pipe. Okay, the next, this is another maybe better view of the whole thing. So pharynx, trachea, and esophagus. At the top of the trachea, at the top of the windpipe, is something called the larynx, more or less the voice box and the vocal cords. When the diagrams show it on the inside, it just looks like this tiny little structure. It's hard to tell. If you want to look at it on the outside, it's more substantial. We're not going to study that in detail. Just know that this is the larynx, the voice box. It's primarily made of cartilage. It has a bunch of different pieces made of cartilage. This part here is the Adam's apple that protrudes, that's visible externally. And so the pharynx, then the larynx. Then the windpipe itself is called the trachea. And it's distinguished with all these ridges, all these rings of cartilage, which you can feel. If you feel your throat and kind of press gently, you will start to feel those ridges, and you are feeling your trachea, the cartilage rings on it. And you are not feeling your esophagus because it is behind, it is out of your reach. Okay, what is the rest of the terminology? So far we've covered the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, and there's this little piece of tissue here which is called the epiglottis. Oh, and that's a typo. There should be no E. The epiglottis. Let me go back to give you a better view of the epiglottis right here. So it's this little piece of soft tissue, which when you eat something and swallow, that piece of tissue gets pushed down, and also the muscles that you use when you're swallowing will contract in such a way that it brings down this piece of tissue. And the reason is because this epiglottis here is covering up the windpipe when you swallow food, because you don't want food to go down your windpipe. You don't want food in your lungs. And so the epiglottis is just this piece of tissue that protects the trachea by covering it up when you swallow. Notice that when you do swallow incorrectly and get something down your windpipe and need to cough it up, it's because something has gone wrong with your swallow. And it happens more easily if you're laughing because you're not using your muscles correctly. Okay. Pharynx, epiglottis, no E there, cross that out. Epiglottis, larynx, voice box, this part here. Then the trachea with all the cartilage rings. And the trachea divides into two large tubes, one in each lung, which then have further divisions. And we're going to call those bronchi. Right here, they're distinguishing primary bronchi, secondary, tertiary. We're not worried about that. The bigger divisions are the bronchi, and then as they get smaller and smaller, they become bronchioles. And the very final terminal end of the bronchioles, of the tubes, after they keep dividing and dividing and dividing, are called the alveoli. Alveoli. So the trachea divides into two bronchi, which divide into further bronchi. And as they get smaller and smaller and smaller, the branchings out, I guess you could call them, the branching out and their divisions, are called bronchioles. And then eventually they extend into alveoli. And so this is just a naming. The alveoli are kind of like the little rounded clusters at the end of each bronchiole. I think on your worksheet you'll see that. So we'll go more into each of those. That's just the basic naming. So here is a diagram which shows nicely how the branchings get really small really quickly. And there's, of course, even more to them than you can see here. Sometimes it's called a bronchial tree, because if you imagine the trachea was here and you turned it upside down, you see how it does look like a tree, the way it keeps branching off. This is just to get a view of the cartilage. Remember that the larynx is made of cartilage, and all these rings or ridges are made of cartilage. And okay, here we go. This is to look at the tissue inside the respiratory tract. So the respiratory tract is what we've just defined with all these parts: pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, etc. The tissue or the cells lining this respiratory tract are specialized, just like all cells in your body are. How are they specialized? The first thing is they are mucous membranes. They're cells which produce and secrete mucus in order to coat the whole respiratory tract with mucus. And they are cells that have a special structure called cilia. So let's take a look at cilia. Oh, sorry, let me just explain. The purpose of mucus, when mucus is secreted, is so that when you breathe in air, you often breathe in pollen and dust. You breathe in equally many pathogens, right? You could be breathing in bacteria or viruses or so on. And mucus is sticky. And so what's the mucus going to do with all those pathogens? Here's a nice gross image. The same thing that fly paper does with flies. The stickiness will just capture them. And so your mucus will be capturing the dust, pollen, and the pathogens that we inhale, right? So as yucky as this image is, it's a good analogy for what the mucus in our respiratory tract is doing. Okay, then the second structure are the cilia. So, okay, here's a written summary. Mucus traps inhaled pathogens. Pathogens are the term for bacteria and viruses, as well as dirt and dust. It prevents the loss of moisture, prevents dehydration. That's the other purpose of mucus. Cilia are these tiny hairs, in quotes, because they look like hairs, but they're not. They're protein fibers, which move. And what is their purpose? So let's look again. Cilia are protein fibers that are found on the surface of a cell membrane. They have motor proteins. They have a way of moving. And what is the purpose of cilia? Their purpose is motion. I say locomotion just because this is not relevant to this class, but you may remember these unicellular organisms which propel themselves around with cilia. They're like little fishies that instead of having big fins, they have many tiny cilia to move themselves. Because a cilia is, as this picture shows, able to beat back and forth, right? In the body, it's not for locomotion, it's for motion. What are the cilia doing? So this is here a close-up of the lining of a respiratory tract, let's say the lining of a trachea. These are long, thin cells. They're kind of long, rectangular cells. And on this side, the cells all have lots and lots of cilia, which can move in such a way that they're moving mucus across the surface of a cell. So they're moving mucus in this direction, let's say. The analogy, which is a really effective analogy, even though it's odd, is it's just like body surfing. The mucus would be the person being moved, and people's arms that are coordinated, moving in a direction to move the person along would correspond to the cilia. So the cilia are all beating this way, even the separate cilia from different cells, in order to move the mucus along. This is a good written summary. So take a moment to write that. Notice something very important. Cilia is always moving mucus upwards, away from the lungs. Where is it going? It's going towards the pharynx, and this might sound very odd, but it's correct. Why towards the pharynx? Mucus can be coughed up, but much more often, because mucus is being produced continuously, and we have it moving up our trachea continuously, to be swallowed. And when you swallow, where does the dirt, the dust, and the pathogens end up? They end up in your stomach. And your stomach can deal with pathogens. It has stomach acid. Go ahead and take a moment to write this down if you haven't already seen it in class. These are just a summary of where mucous membranes are found, all body cavities, all openings, and what their purposes are, what the purpose of mucus is in different places. This is another set of, this is a diagram and a real photograph of tissues lining the respiratory tract. So there are long, thin cells with lots and lots of cilia. So many cilia, it looks like fur, right? But they're moving, they're continuously in motion to move the mucus upwards and away from the lungs. And there are other cells whose job is to produce and secrete mucus, right? Those are called goblet cells. Goblet cells produce mucus. All the other cells are ciliated to move the mucus and pathogens out. Okay, another structure is in your nose. Amazingly, the nose seems so simple, it would seem that there's nothing to it at all, but deep inside your nose, there's some structures which are kind of like bony shelves coming off from the nasal cavity. Let me just show you really quickly this picture here. Do you see how they're coming off the nasal cavity in this way? The third set is up there. You can't see it. And why are they doing that? They're increasing the surface area of the nasal cavity. So the nasal cavity, like all body openings, like the entire respiratory tract, is lined with what? Of course, it's lined with mucous membranes. So really, they're increasing the surface area of the mucous membranes. You can, if you stop to think about it, I bet you can guess why they're doing that. As air flows in now, air has to be separated into these 4 different areas, right? And each, instead of being one large passageway, just one big amount of air flowing through the nose, it's these smaller, thinner sections of air that are surrounded by more mucous membranes. So obviously what happens is that there's a much, much higher chance that the bad stuff in the air you're breathing, the dust, the pathogens, will get cleaned by the mucus. The bad stuff in it will get trapped by the mucus. So that's why the increase in surface area is so important. Pause to write these down. Oh, let me add one thing. Okay, so this we've talked about. There's 2 further jobs that mucus has, or that those nasal passages has. The mucus also humidifies the air, because dry air is not good for you. And there's lots of blood vessels up there to warm the air. So the air is cleaned of pathogens, warmed up by the blood vessels, and humidified. So that when your lungs get the air, it is air that's good for you. Slightly moist and warmer than it would be if you were breathing dry air on a very cold winter day. Okay, here the cartilage has been colored blue just so it is more visible, and so you see again the larynx is made of cartilage, and all these cartilage rings along the trachea and along the bronchi and the larger bronchi. The purpose of the cartilage rings, can you try to guess what it is? If you think about it, it's all right that the esophagus collapses. It'll just open up when you swallow food, but your trachea should never, ever, ever collapse. It always needs to be propped open. And so the cartilage is structurally giving it kind of a rigidity, keeping it open, so that you never have trouble breathing, so that your airway stays open. You could think of that being important for a little kid, someone who's elderly, someone who faints, people who are playing rough and wrestling, someone who gets in a car accident and the seatbelt is pressing against them. So you can think of all the ways in which pressing against your trachea could be dangerous if it didn't have something to prop it open. The cartilage rings are C-shaped. This is kind of just a detail, but the cartilage rings are C-shaped. This is seen from above. So this is like cut across your throat. Here is the trachea. Here is the esophagus. Anterior means the front. Here's the front of the person. That's the back of the person. So the cartilage rings have a C shape. And the reason is because behind it, the esophagus, it's not big and open like this. This is a real photograph. It's pretty much collapsed. See that smushed up thing? That is your collapsed, smushed esophagus. But when you take a big bite, it'll have to open up and expand. When it opens up and expands, it'll expand into this area. And so the cartilage won't get in its way. I just answered that question already. Okay. This is really cool. When you breathe, the air follows the trachea, goes into the bronchi, and keeps branching out into smaller and smaller branchings till it gets to the bronchioles, and it ends up at the very, very end. The terminal end of the bronchioles are these little clusters of air sacs. They look kind of like grape clusters. The air sacs are called alveoli, and these are actually inflatable. These are actually a little bit like balloons. You could think of them as tiny balloons, and there's many of them there. So what is the importance of them? They're actually super important. The bronchioles terminate in tiny air sacs called alveoli. Alveoli are the site of gas exchange. The gases being O2 is exchanged with CO2. We're exhaling CO2 and inhaling O2, obviously. And so let's look at that more carefully. The alveoli are covered with this absolute network